So good morning, everyone. I guess we're live and we're ready to go. So look, I'm very happy to chair this second session of this Royal Society of Canada meeting. We're going to have two talks. They're going to be 30 minutes each. We're going to have 5 minutes question after the first one, and then a combined 10 minutes session at the end for questions for the second talk and for a discussion of both presentations. Um, this session is about how past investments in life sciences have helped us prepare for the pandemic, how this response has been analyzed, and used to prepare for future investment in health emergencies, but also to fix perhaps deficiencies in the system, and also to invest in all research areas. Look, personally, I'm extremely happy and honored to have Professor John Bell, who's a Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford. Sir John Bell, sorry, John. He has served as chair of the UK Office for the Strategic Coordination of Health Research. He was appointed by the Prime Minister a few years ago as one of the two UK life science champions. He's responsible for producing the Academy of Medical Sciences Strengthening Clinical Research report. And he also wrote the UK Life Science Industrial Strategy. John's a friend of Canada. We often tap him for advice and wisdom. John, thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Philippe. It's really great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. I thought I would scamper through two things today. One is to give you a little bit of context as to how we engaged the wide life sciences ecosystem in the UK, going back actually quite a few years, about 10 years, most recently with two life sciences strategies, which we've put together and which the government, in fairness to them, have supported quite substantially. And then to actually give you some examples about how that agenda of developing the life sciences, the interaction between big companies, small companies, academia, the NHS, and charities actually really helped us during COVID, because those were all the people we needed on point to make a success of trying to deal with the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to tie those two things together, and I'm going to start by just giving you a bit of a review of why we did the life sciences strategy. First slide, please. Yeah, so I wrote this with my colleagues at the Office of Life Sciences in 2016 after Theresa May became Prime Minister in the sort of post-Brexit decision. And the idea was to try and find ways to build economic growth out of the life sciences in the UK. Next slide, please. And the fundamentals were that we had a really strong science base. We had the biggest biotech cluster outside the US. We have a fantastic single-payer health system, which is cradle to grave with health data associated with it. We've got a really innovative drug regulator, and it turns out that it's the most productive sector in the UK economy. So we were starting in a pretty good place. Next slide, please. And what's happened over the past 10 to 15 years is largely due to both government and industrial investment is pretty impressive. And that involves a lot of fixed assets in the big centers of excellence. The new Edinburgh's campus, AstraZeneca opens their new building next week, I think, and that's a terrific campus with the LMB and other things. The Old Road campus in Oxford, also very exciting place, 12 different institutes all lined up. The Crick you know about, the Sanger Center you know about, Harwell you may not know about, but it's got the Diamond Synchrotron, the Rosalind Franklin, and the likes. So we've invested a lot in making this work. Next slide, please. And of course, the Golden Triangle you know about. This is where that's the hub for most of this activity. Oxford and Cambridge, with now roughly the same number of biotech companies in both places. Lots of scaling companies now, and London emerging as the third important bit of the triangle, with growing numbers of biotech companies in that space and a very large amount of potential risk capital investment. Next slide, please. So when we sat down to work out whether this was going to be competitive or not, we did quite a lot of work with McKinsey's to work out where we sat in the world. And you can see that this is a comparison between ourselves and France and Germany and Israel, all of which are well known in this space. And when you look across these metrics, public spend per weighted publication, we do better than everybody, and much better than some. Weighted publications per patent, we don't do so well, so that's not a great place. Jobs per public spend, we're the best, and gross value added per public spend, Israel and ourselves are about the same. So the basics for this were good. Next slide, please. And when we looked at the productivity per sector, the UK's got a productivity problem, but I think one of the main reasons for that is if you look, this is the most productive sector by far in the UK economy. And the least productive sector is our biggest sector, which is financial services. And as you all know, all the financial guys do is push paper around. So that's why they're not very productive. But that I think shows you why life sciences is a really interesting place for developed economies to invest. Next slide, please. So in broad terms, we produced a strategy which, in fairness to the government, they have really followed assiduously for the past few years, right up to COVID. But the whole focus was to strengthen the science base, use data to enhance clinical trials, create this opportunity to scale innovative companies, focus on new technologies like viral vectors, cell therapies, nucleic acid therapies, try and get the NHS to be a better adopter of innovation, and crucially, to create 3 new industries in the life sciences in the UK. Next slide, please. And those 3 industries that we chose, are chosen for very specific reasons. One is, these are areas where the UK's got a very substantial lead and where we think we can really make a big impact. And the 3 areas won't be surprising to you. The first is genomics, where we've had literally decades of investment and a huge amount of success, particularly in large-scale genomic experiments, but also sequencing technology and the like. The second big domain is digital health, where again, we could take advantage of the health records within the NHS, which are getting steadily better. And the third area, which was promoted interestingly by industry, was to see whether we could move the paradigm for healthcare much further to the left so that we were identifying and diagnosing diseases a lot earlier. And you'll all be familiar with the diagnostic tools that are allowing that to happen. The real question is, if you introduce interventions early, can you flatten the morbidity curve and make healthcare systems more sustainable? So those are the 3 big areas that we wanted to chase. Next slide, please. In the genomic space, we already had UK Biobank, but we leaned into that with funding from industry and the Wellcome Trust in government to do whole genomes on all 500,000 people in UK Biobank. That project has just completed the 500,000 genomes this month. I think Rory Collins can tell you more about that later in the day. Of course, Genomics England continues to churn on doing genomes in the NHS for diagnosis of cancer and rare disease. And then our early diagnostic cohort, which is now called Our Future Health, is undertaking to collect 5 million consented participants and doing polygenic SNP, polygenic risk scores in all 5 million. So, you know, we're now rolling out genomics at a pretty big level across the NHS and across the UK. Next slide, please. Big data of all kinds, enabling clinical decisions. Click it on, please. Lots of different types of data, imaging, digital pathology, clinical phenotypes, lab tests, digital monitoring, and that's generating algorithms for diagnostics, therapeutics responses. And we're now finding that this is a very powerful tool when we merge things like digital imaging, digital pathology, along with whole genome sequencing data. And the interaction between those two has turned out to be massively interesting for machine learning and the likes. Next slide, please. So lots of different types of data. I won't spend a lot of slide on this. You know the kind of things we can get. We're collecting almost all these different types of data for the Our Future Health project. It'll be the largest data set, research data set for biomedical science on the planet. It's basically the same size as Denmark, but with all the associated data assets. Next slide, please. And that digital environment comes from 65 million people, comprehensive GP record, coded hospital admission data, genomic enrichment in lots of these people, digital pathology, radiology, and then a lot of analytical tools, which we've developed alongside, which I won't spend a lot of time on. But these are all features of our life sciences strategy. Next slide, please. And as a part of that, we've also had a real interest in improving efficiency of clinical development, which is one of the things that we've tried to capture, trying to do more digital trials inside the NHS. And Martin Landry and Rory Collins have both led on this to great success. And this is working extremely well. Next slide, please. And the final piece of this original strategy was this cohort of 5 million people designed to actually enable early diagnostics of disease, but also have a cohort where you could recall people of a wide set of different ethnic diversities and socioeconomic diversities. Next slide, please. This will be a cohort of adults aged 20 to 110, full diversity in the population, biological samples and health data, consent to access their NHS records, and then the ability to reconsent and reapproach these people for a whole variety of different studies within that subset. So this is an ambitious project. We're just about to start full recruitment in this now. Next slide, please. And this is how it'll work for 5 million healthy individuals. As it says, age 30 to 75, we've dropped that age to 20 to 75, or 20 to 100, actually. Polygenic risk scores on everybody, repeated blood samples in 1 million, and then they go into a trusted research environment with their NHS data where we can recall them or study them. And so far, we've raised about £300 million for this project. It'll be enough, I think, to get it off the ground, and we're anticipating raising another £150 million to complete it. So that looks like a good project. Next slide, please. Now the outputs from this first life sciences strategy, just to put all this in perspective, we brought in 3 new pharma discovery centers. The relationship has been terrific. The new AstraZeneca headquarters in Cambridge is a part of this. We've done the world's largest genomic sequencing program in UK Biobank. We've got the world's largest digital pathology program, now aligned with genomics. The cohort I've talked to you about. We've got a number of new institutes, the Nucleic Acid Therapy Accelerator, the Rosalind Franklin Institute, and the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Center, and a very large NHS digital trial program. So this has been really productive. It's brought in about $3.5 billion of inward investment for an investment from government of about 600 million. So it's a pretty good bit of leverage. And part of the thing along the way was we have really got to know the industry well and are on very good terms with the industry about doing things together. Next slide, please. So this summer, we've written another one called the Life Sciences Vision. This is another crack at how academia, charities, funders, the NHS can work with industry. Next slide, please. And this one has shifted its focus a little bit. And this is a bit of data that Clive Meanwell, who developed the inclisiran project, generated through his population health partners. And it's quite a striking observation. And that is, if you look since the year 2000 to now in the US, the revenue from the top 10 drugs sold has gone up 2.5-fold. But the population served by the top 10 drugs has fallen 6.5-fold. So what that means is the cost per patient for top 10 drugs has gone up 16.5-fold. And this is the result, I think, of the industry being pushed to work in rare disease and in specialty pharma, where the diseases in the right table are really the diseases which healthcare systems are having to deal with. So our current iteration of the life sciences strategy is to try and work with industry to re-engage on some of those really big indications to see whether we can have an impact in that space. Next slide, please. And around that, we've set out a set of missions. They're described here. Obesity is obviously one. The focus on that came through the COVID pandemic, where it was very clear that we've got a problem in the population. Obviously, dementia, another one, again, highlighted because the high level of mortality in elderly people, particularly in care homes, often with dementia. The early diagnosis of cancer, something that will greatly improve cancer survival statistic. Cardiovascular disease prevention, we're already well into that. And then vaccines and pandemic preparedness is something that we're also doing now with a large number of companies, onshoring quite a lot of vaccine capabilities in research, manufacturing and development. And we've also got an interest in mental health. And you know, many of these things are things that have been highlighted by the most recent events of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So we think the UK is a great hub for this kind of population research. I think the vaccine rollout, the vaccine development in the UK shows how powerful that's been. We've got a wide range of ethnic diversity, socioeconomic groups, comprehensive health records. These are all the things that I think make the UK a really good place to do this. And industry, I think, agrees because they've come along on the ride for this second iteration of our strategy. Next slide, please. Now, we've also got a push to try and expand the biotech sector. It's part of the strategy. Biotech sector didn't play a big role in COVID, but we're trying to make it more ambitious and bigger. It's a large cluster in the southeast of England. We've got a large financial center in London. The two haven't connected properly, and we're now developing a strategy for getting growth capital out of the city to help develop the biotech sector in the UK. But it's also associated with a lot of regulatory reform and a whole set of new risk capital investors who've been attracted to the UK because of our success in COVID. Next slide, please. And all this is played out with the government reinforcing the crucial role that life sciences played in national resilience. And we've just been through a spending review. This is funding for the next 4 years. Our life sciences strategy has been funded pretty much in full, and there's been a 30% uplift in the overall science budget, much of it going to the life sciences strategies. So the UK will now be spending about 20 billion a year on the science base, with very strong support for data and genomics, and also for vaccines and pandemic preparedness. Next slide, please. So when we ran into COVID in December 2019, we were in a pretty good place because all the people who could actually make a difference to the COVID response all knew each other pretty well. On my phone, I had the phone numbers of almost every chief scientist of every important pharma or diagnostic company. They all had my phone number, and we worked really well together to help develop the strategy in the UK. And just to be crystal clear, we started really badly in COVID. It was a complete mess. Government wasn't anticipating a problem. The NHS was a mess. Testing was terrible. It was a real shocker. And over the course of the first 6 months, we really turned all that around and got ourselves in a much better place. And I'll just take you through a few of those slides to show you how we got there. Next slide, please. So to start with, this is a great slide from the Wellcome Trust, because up till 2019 or early months of 2020, people had forgotten, well, obviously Philippe hasn't forgotten this, but most people had forgotten that infectious diseases are really still, for the 20th century, were the biggest single cause of death, and globally, and they remain a major threat to human populations. And I think one of the things that COVID has done is they've reminded us that we've got to continue to lean into infections, and indeed immunity to infections, as that's a really crucial bit of the puzzle. And fortunately, the UK has got a strong infectious disease and immunology community, as well as really strong academic groups in vaccinology and also in microbiology and testing. So that's turned out to be a big advance. Next slide, please. So this tells you a little bit about the stuff we did in Oxford during the course of the pandemic, but it's highlighted because it shows that although we were heavily involved in the vaccine, we developed challenge studies in Oxford, we ran the recovery trial, we're developing an global adult vaccination program. We also led on much of the testing, both PCR and lateral flow testing, and we've developed a global pathogen analysis system. All these things were done with industry, and that really enabled us to move very much faster, enabled by all the capacities that industry had in play. And I think this is a great illustration of how the life sciences strategy fed straight into the COVID epidemic and enabled us to move much faster and much more efficiently with partnerships with these companies. Next slide, please. So let me talk very briefly about the testing, because testing, I think, has been underestimated in the COVID pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was almost no capacity in NHS and Public Health England. I think they were capable of about 4,000 tests a day at the beginning of the pandemic. We took the testing out of those places and put it in designated PCR labs. And they're now do anything from 6, 7, 8, even up to 900,000 tests a day. I mean, it's a very, very impressive, centralized function, totally automated PCR testing. And we did all that early work with Thermo, who was able to provide us with an almost unlimited supply of PCR tests, but also quite a lot of kit to be able to do it. We also built some pretty good ELISA methodology. We made a great Thermo ELISA in Oxford using the recombinant protein from diamonds made by Dave Stewart. That, in a head-to-head study, was probably the most sensitive ELISA created by a commercial company. We're still using it to run tens of thousands of tests a day. And then the third piece was lateral flow validation. This is something which the UK is a real specialty in the UK, because in June of 2020, we were asked to work with Porton Down to develop lateral flow tests. And of course, at the time, everybody said, oh, they don't work, they're not sensitive enough. Next slide, please. But we spent months doing this. We tested 140 kits. We found 52 that worked pretty well. And one of the crucial elements to this is that we did discover a really important observation. And this was work done by Tim Pito and Derek Crook in Oxford. And that is, we went to the testing, the big testing sites where people were being swabbed. We got our hands on 18,000 nasal swabs that were positive. And then we went to, and those were the 18,000 nasal swabs that were positive from people who went on and infected another person, because the contact tracing system allowed us to do that. There were lots of people with positive swabs who didn't infect anybody, but we found the 18,000 that did. And then we tested those to see which of these lateral flow tests would detect the people who were infectious, who didn't have RNA on the end of the swab, but who were actually infectious. And you can see the sensitivity in this is really pretty impressive. It was, for many of these tests, they're well over 90% sensitive, and they're 99.9% specific. So that really gave rise to an opportunity to use these at scale. Next slide, please. And this is just another way of demonstrating how sensitive these actually are in the context of that infectious population. Next slide, please. And you can see that as soon as we worked out what was going on, which took us to, really took us to the autumn, when we started to scale the use of lateral flow tests, you can see that these took off. They've been used in schools, universities. The whole National Health Service everybody in the NHS gets given a box of these every month. They swab twice a day. And they've been hugely effective at controlling the pandemic before we could actually control it any other way, by getting people to test regularly. And the whole UK population have now become experts at sticking a swab up their nose and doing a lateral flow test. So I think this is one of our great successes. And we were greatly enabled by the regulator in the UK giving us permission to use these on a self-use basis. And the evidence that it's been very useful is now all over the UK, because that's a very powerful piece of the control strategy. Next slide, please. Just as an addendum, I think there's an interesting question about when you stop doing PCR and you just do lateral flow testing. And I think we're almost at that point. Recovery, again, the big trial here, which is easily the most successful trial globally for COVID-19 therapies. The data, tocilizumab, Regeneron antibodies, dexamethasone, all successful repurposed drugs, and lots of ineffective medicines that everybody told you were great and worked, and none of them did. So, this is how you use the data that we generated and the structure we generated from the life sciences strategy to do large-scale trials in the presence of a pandemic. We were fast, we could scale it, we got to 40,000 patients very quickly, and the reason is we had our life sciences strategy in play. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time on vaccines because you all know a lot about vaccines, but I think one of the exciting things about this pandemic is, the industry has broadly developed a really set of exciting new vaccine platforms. The mRNA platform, well, the adenovirus platform, you probably also know. And these have got some very interesting differences in terms of how they stimulate and develop immune responses, both in B cells and T cells. They're both really good platforms. They produce pretty similar efficacy data if you look exactly at the same type of patient populations. Next slide, please. And where Oxford was very involved was, of course, working with AstraZeneca to develop their vaccine. This vaccine has been hugely successful. It's got very good efficacy rates and is used globally and is probably the dominant vaccine on a global basis. Next slide, please. The data from this, I won't go over. The efficacy compared to the control population was extremely good. And it was particularly good, next slide, on preventing severe disease, hospitalization, severe disease, and death. Next slide, please. And you can see this is the first readout of that. We've had now subsequent readouts from the big AstraZeneca study where out of 21 people hospitalized or dying from the disease, 20 of them were in the control population. One of them was in the vaccinated population. So in terms of turning off the tap for very severe disease, this is a great vaccine. Next slide, please. And these are broadly the efficacy data from the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccines. And you can see this is Public Health England data against hospitalization. The efficacy is pretty good. The Pfizer vaccine is probably slightly better against symptomatic disease and against transmission, but against hospitalization, they're pretty similar. Next slide, please. Now, the big interesting question at the moment is durability for these vaccines. And I just thought I'd show you some of this. This is all out of the ONS study. It's really interesting data. It's now actually published in Nature Medicine. And you can see that these are all measures of the durability after the second dose. And the pink line and the green line are the RNA vaccine, and the purple line and the blue line are the adenovirus vaccine. And you can see that over time, there is quite a significant decay in efficacy, these measured by, in this case, by testing positive. And it's quite striking because it really picks up, particularly in people with long-term health conditions and old people after about 75 days after the second dose. And it is quite striking that the RNA vaccines have less durability than the adeno vaccine. Next slide, please. And you can also quantitate that just straight up between Chadox and the Pfizer vaccine. Again, you see the same thing. You can see the loss of durability of the RNA vaccines. The adenovirus vaccine loses durability as well, but it occurs at a much less steep pace. Next slide, please. And you can also quantitate this based on probability of a low CT value. And this data is really striking. And you can see the change in that probability is quite striking. So by the time you get out to 4 months, the two lines cross. You always start better with an RNA vaccine. You have much higher serological titers. But over time, the two things become pretty similar. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. And one of the reasons I think for this is that lots of studies, particularly those from Paul Moss's group in Birmingham, show that the adenovirus vaccines are producing very strong T cell responses, particularly in elderly populations, which is where the decay in the protection seems to occur first from the mRNA vaccines. And hot off the press, next slide, very recent New England Journal. If you read your New England Journal today, you would have seen this. Again, the RNA vaccines start with a much higher neutralizing antibody titer than the Ad26 vaccine from J&J. But interestingly, they decay over time, where if anything, the J&J vaccine, the serological response gets better over time. And the T cell responses, as I just indicated, the adenovirus vaccines are better and they stay better for quite prolonged periods. So I think there's an interesting story on kinetics of immune responses. And I think this is going to play out over a longer period of time. where people have head-to-head data. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to skip over this. Could you just scoot through this? There's a few slides talking about my friends in Europe and why there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy. I don't think I need to show those, but I think you guys understand what was going on there. I just wanted to just come around to show that our relationship with AstraZeneca, which really emerged out of the life sciences strategy, has been terrific. They've got vaccine approvals now all over the globe. Next slide, please. And yesterday we hit 2 billion doses globally in 170 countries. So this is a workhorse vaccine, 4-degree cold chain, has been terrifically effective. Next slide, please. There are a few other things we've done with industry, which has also been powerful. We've had a close relationship with Oracle. This is a genome, a pathogen and analytics system, which has been developed for COVID and is now being deployed around the world, which allows you to align raw sequence data and identify variants as part of a pool in a global cloud. That's being pretty widely taken up, particularly in Africa and the developing world. Next slide, please. We're almost at the end. Here we go. Where we go next, I think, is pretty interesting, but hopefully we'll leave behind a legacy for future pandemics of extensive vaccine applications around the world that could actually have quite a profound effect. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, John, for just a wonderful talk. Look, I have, I'll use the, chair privilege to ask, maybe one question or two. One, how did you manage to, have the sustained commitment and interest from the government in funding, research before all of these, industry partnership, which essentially created the base for these industry partnership and for the response to COVID? How did you do that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. The clever answer was that the government was smart enough to realize that health resilience required lots of industrial input. That's not the correct answer, because that was the reason that they funded this was not because they knew a pandemic was coming. They funded it because the government here is very interested in the economic growth agenda. And in the last decade, and you will have seen this just from your own work, is that in many cases, the interests of academia and industry very substantially overlap. The industry has become much more scientific in terms of the approach that they use to develop new drugs and new diagnostics. And the overlap is really quite substantial. And I think the government, we've been able to persuade the government that being able to attract inward investment from global life sciences is good for the economy. You employ the right kind of people at scale. You can export, the trade balance data is really fantastic. And there's been a joint commitment to this from both the Department of Business and the Department of Health, which has been another key bit to this, Philippe, is to try and get multiple bits of government engaged. And now increasingly Treasury and Number 10 are involved. So it's been quite a long journey, but the tide has been quietly going up over a 20-year time frame in the UK. And you guys will have spotted it from Canada, is that, it hasn't always gone up dramatically, but support from government has just steadily increased.
Thank you, John, for this question. There's a question for this answer. I think you also need like a person like you to actually open the doors and make sure stuff gets done. There's a question from Mark Lateral in the chat. I will ask it. John, you know well the Canadian biomedical health environment, e.g. as evaluator of CHR, taking account your experience in the UK also. Where do you see opportunities for Canada and the challenges to overcome so as to boost these sectors?
Yeah, so Canada has a number of really powerful advantages in this space, but it will require, getting over some barriers. So for example, you have a comprehensive single-payer healthcare system, which makes things like digital clinical trials, large-scale epidemiology, large cohorts, it makes it a lot easier. The disadvantage is that it's fragmented across the provinces. And at some level, you're going to have to, I think, get at least a few of the provinces to work together to make that work. And you know, it's not that big an ask because it shouldn't impact their ability to deliver healthcare. But if you could get access to the, you know, let's say you got 3 or 4 decent sized provinces to work together, you could do just as well as the UK. And in fact, you might well be able to do better because some of your health data is better than ours. So I would strongly suggest you lean into that because there's a real opportunity. And if some provinces don't want to play, as I suspect my homeland at Alberta won't want to play, but anyway, just leave those guys alone. You could do it with the guys who do want to work together, and that could be hugely powerful. And I think that would be the first thing I would try and do.
Thank you, John. I think we're going to have to move along to Mona. Thank you again for doing this. It was wonderful to get your experience and wisdom on these important topics. So I'm also very happy and privileged to have the Chief Science Advisor to the Canadian Prime Minister, Mona Nemer, to be with us. She's also a Science Advisor to the Ministers of Innovation, Science and Industry, and the rest of the Cabinet. Prior to this, she was VP of Research at University of Ottawa, also Director of Molecular Genetics and Cardiac Regeneration Laboratory, and before that, she had a illustrious career as a scientist at the Clinical Research Institute in Montreal. Thank you, Mona, for taking time of to come and chat with us about the Canadian response to COVID. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation.
It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of this symposium that's celebrating the 200th anniversary of my alma mater. And just, for the record, I did my PhD at McGill working on the chemical synthesis of RNA. And in those days, we could, barely dream that one day we're going to have vaccines and therapeutics that are RNA-based. So here we are, and I think it's a testament to the quality, the exceptional quality and vision of many of the professors and researchers at McGill University over the years, people like yourself, actually, Philippe. So just want to have a shout out for my alma mater and wishing another 100 years of success and research excellence as well. So I guess I want to also thank John Bell for all the great work that has been done in the UK and for making us really look so dysfunctional. I do want to mention, however, that we had a lot of very cooperative, collaborative, and helpful interactions with our UK counterparts over the past 18 months, and just want to acknowledge and thank them for their continued generosity and help as well. So if I can have the next slide. Unlike the UK, we didn't start necessarily from a very well-coordinated situation in Canada when the pandemic hit. So just a reminder of how we fund R&D in general and in life science in particular. I have put it linear, not because it is linear, but because this is how We have viewed it over the years in Canada, and I think that John has clearly demonstrated that a more integrated vision between the different actors is, the way to go. So in terms of the funding for basic and applied research, which happens mostly at research institutes and post-secondary institutions, universities, academic hospitals, colleges, etc. They're funded by granting agencies and councils, provincial governments as well, foundations, not-for-profit. And then we move to the more applied and translational part, and that's usually the space where we have the startups, and they're funded by some federal government programs, as well as provincial. I've given here some examples of the NRC IRAP, the Strategic Innovation Fund. Genome Canada is both in the green and in the yellow box. Of course, they're in the gray zone. We have the venture capital, and you can see that the two arrows are not connecting, and that's on purpose, because I think we all recognize that we have a gap between the basic and applied research that happens in the institutions and moving it to the startup and along the innovation path. So we'll try to address this. And then the next phase is, of course, the manufacturing of products, etc., and that's largely done by industry. Canada, of course, had a very strong pharmaceutical industry presence in the 1970s and early 80s, including on vaccine manufacturing, which unfortunately sort of scaled back due to a number of issues, including regulatory conditions, but also what was happening in the pharmaceutical industries in terms of consolidations, regrouping, etc. So if I can have the next slide. So the response to when we had of course COVID, and everybody recognized how much science we need and how much knowledge we need to acquire very quickly to fight the pandemic. The government provided funding through existing mechanisms, which was, I guess, the fastest way of providing the response. So as early as February, we had the first CIHR rapid response competition. The government, through some of the strategic innovation funds, provided funds as well on the applied side to Vido Intervac, that was manufacturing vaccines, early stage, that is Blue Dot for analytics and data integration, and provided as well funds for two I guess medium-sized companies that have grown since AppCellular, that had an alliance later to basically commercialize monoclonal antibody therapies, and Metigago, whose vaccine, innovative actually vaccine using plants to manufacture, is completing phase 3 clinical trials. Government also realized that we don't have many infrastructure to be able to develop and produce at scale. So the initial investment in the NRC, in the Human Health and Therapeutic Facility, to upgrade to a GMP grade was provided. Next slide. So over the course of the past year, there were additional funds that were provided again through existing mechanisms. And as a result, we not only actually provided funds to CIHR, for example, to answer for the data monitoring and modeling initiative. But there were a number of task forces that were set up and networks organized. So the immunity task force that was set up early on to do mostly serology and assess the level of immunity in the country prior to vaccine development actually morphed into much more, into an organization that funded a lot of immunity and at present vaccine surveillance research. ChemcoGen was put in place together with work from CIHR to look at basically sequence the virus and the host, and they've been very active, of course, since December, where they scaled up sequencing in collaboration with public health agencies to look at variant spread in the country. You know, I will not go through all of the different investments, but suffice it to say that the government, you know, has provided a substantive amount of fund over the course of the pandemic, probably by now close to $3 billion, excluding the latest budget, which I'll get to in a sec. But unfortunately, our system remained fragmented and, you know, unnecessarily complex, which created a lot of challenges in terms of coordination and agility as needed in fighting a pandemic. So I think there were a lot of lessons learned, which we have started taking stock of, have informed our nascent life science strategy. And I think in the coming years, we still have, you know, a lot to analyze and adapt in terms of our, you know, agility and the coordination in normal times, so that we can really mount an effective response. And the question, of course, is our system is based on competition, and competition and peer reviews are, of course, the gold standards in research funding. The question is, when you have an emergency and what you have a global pandemic of the scale that we have for COVID-19, the question is whether actually reaching out and bringing people to work together, bringing the best minds to work together in networks and consortia, whether they are in academia, in government, or in industry, is superior or not to the usual, you know, competition-based system. So I think these are some important questions that we're gonna have to ask ourselves over the coming years, and not only ask ourselves, but answer and put in place accordingly the resulting governance and the resulting mechanisms. Next slide. So I think it's fair to say that, and I should have said this earlier, you know, I really want to highlight the incredible efforts of the Canadian scientific community, both in life sciences, but also in the natural sciences, whether from the physics, chemists, or engineering communities, as well as the social sciences, who have really stepped up to the plate, both in terms of doing research under difficult circumstances, but also in lending very generously their time and expertise to government, you know, on different task forces, advisory groups. So I think this really needs to be underscored, and it's really highlighted the importance of the sector, the importance of research and researchers, and the fact that they are part of the solution, and not as I guess historically viewed as a sort of interest group on their own. So I think that was something that was very positive. Of course, Canada was in close contact with our international peers. We were represented at WHO, various WHO committees by CIHR. I was in touch with my counterparts internationally, and we had many exchanges of knowledge and data and so on. And of course, the government, civil service, as well as the ministers were as well in touch with their counterparts. So as a country, I think we were good team players. We played well with others, but our system did not allow us to achieve what the UK has achieved in terms of, being able to focus on a smaller number of initiatives, but have the power to bring them to a completion with the proper statistical powers and so on, to inform pandemic management and to provide actually products to fight the pandemic for the rest of the globe. So, back to what the COVID pandemic has revealed in Canada. So it revealed a number of gaps, of course, which were exacerbated when we had to work very, very quickly, and when we had to work across a very fragmented system in terms of the health delivery as well. And John mentioned that, health is a provincial jurisdiction, and the management of the pandemic was, very much a provincial sort of management, and it was fragmented across the country. We struggled to put data together that was coming from different jurisdictions, whether it's in terms of surveillance, whether it's in terms of the actual infection rates, etc. Of course, things got better over the course of the pandemic, but we still have a long ways to go. Our ability to drive mission-focused R&D, I think, was also, put in question. We did not have the sort of culture and the mechanisms to work together as a country, both across sectors, with the government, with industry, and with academia. We had great examples of people coming together very quickly, and I do have to underscore the extraordinary flexibility and agility of our regulators in many instances to allow things to move faster. But there are things that you just can't do on the fly, and having platforms for clinical trial, for example, capacity, having platforms for developing diagnostics, for scaling up diagnostics and therapeutics were simply didn't exist in Canada, and that's something that we certainly are trying to overcome in the coming years. I spoke about data and research coordination. I think that has been a great irritant to researchers and to public health authorities in general, which limited really our ability to act very quickly at the very beginning, for example, of the spread of a variant, etc. And then we realized that we're very limited in our search capacity. And John spoke to the capacities that existed at NHS, for example, for PCR testing. And we had the same issues except that all our public health authorities in the different provinces and territories scaled up. And then this came at the at the expense of other activities that they had to do, and that had, of course, great repercussions, negative ones, on our ability to manage things, health issues other than COVID and infectious diseases, but we'll get to that. So these are the kind of gaps that were revealed, and the issues that will need to be solved in our upcoming strategies, both in terms of research, but also in terms of management and preparedness for the next pandemics. Next slide. So, recently we had a beginning of a biomedical and life science strategy that is in direct response to those gaps that were identified. And the objectives are simply to grow a strong, competitive domestic life sciences sector and manufacturing capabilities. This is super important for our resilience and our health, security and autonomy, and to make sure that Canada is prepared for pandemics and other future health emergencies. So to put the proper basis to be able to tackle in a more agile and effective manner any future health emergencies. Next slide. So the strategy, and you can, this is a slide that's taken from it, so I invite you to take a look at it. Has some pillars, which is collaborations and a coordinated governance, laying the foundation for research systems and talent pipelines, and talent is an incredibly important aspect here. Growing businesses, so both looking at existing and emerging areas of strength and making sure that we can grow them, build them up, build them out, have the capacity to have national facilities that can produce vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, and importantly, enable large-scale clinical trials, so addressing both the needed platforms and regulatory systems that perhaps put impediments to such ambitions. So the next slide. The strategy was accompanied by an initial investment of about $1 billion in the last budget. And this is starting to roll out. There were some initial calls for this. So there is an infrastructure fund that aims to make sure that we have the infrastructure needed, whether in terms of level 2, 3 labs or others for biobanking, etc. The ability to have operating funds to do applied and translational research, so mend that first valley of death, while at the same time developing talent and training more people, and having the pipelines for new technologies moved from the lab along the pipeline. And then last but not least, a clinical trial fund, precisely to make sure that we can train and have mentorship for clinical trialists, for all the research personnel needed, but also the infrastructure and platforms and networks that will make sure that we're ready as needed. So this is starting to roll out, and again, this will be under a shared governance. So there will be an advisory council, as well as a strategic review board that will make sure that the investments are actually coordinated and are being provided according to the intended objectives of the strategy. Next slide, sorry. So, of course, the long-term vision is to have a sustainable science ecosystem that's coherent, coordinated, and agile, and that's really serving us well all the way from bench to community. So this means not only that we're going to be needing increased investments in the different parts of the ecosystem, but that we will also need to have better governance to make sure that we are indeed coordinated and coherent, because we just can't afford unbalances in any one part of the system if really we want to deliver on the vision. Next slide. So I'm actually very optimistic that we are going to get there over the coming years. And the government is actually very serious in its intent. Canada is a signatory to an ambitious G7 mission. It's called the 100 Days Mission, where the goal is within the first 100 days from a pandemic threat being identified, the following intervention should be available, safe, effective, and affordable. So accurate diagnostics, effective therapeutics, and vaccines produced at scales. So you can see that this is a very ambitious proposition, and I want to underscore the incredible leadership of our UK colleagues in driving this during the UK G7 presidency. Next slide. So as said, the 100-day mission, so the way it will basically function is that there has to be enhanced surveillance, enhanced development of readiness for platforms for the diagnostics, the vaccines, and the therapeutics as well. So next slide. If we look if we try to put this timeline over the COVID-19 timelines, this is what it would look like. So 100-day would coincide with early May. And I remind you that early May, many countries were still struggling with scaling up of diagnostics. We definitely did not have therapeutics, and we did not have vaccines either. So I think this is ambitious, it's doable, and it has many repercussions in terms of how the signatory countries are going to make sure that their investments and their systems, their ecosystem is able to respond and be consistent with this 100 days mission timeline. Next slide. So, of course, we've talked a lot about the pandemic, and the 100-day mission is to respond to the pandemic. The hope in Canada is that as we tackle improved pandemic preparedness, that this will also help us address or lay at least the foundation in terms of physical and human infrastructure for addressing the many other unmet clinical needs, whether it's cancer, cardiovascular diseases, cerebrovascular diseases, obesity, diabetes, mental health, and I'm not going to list all of them, but certainly we have our eyes on exactly the same chronic diseases, if I can say, as the UK, and there is still a lot to do to come anywhere close to addressing the unmet clinical needs in all of these diseases. Next slide. So the vision and the hope is that as we move forward, we are going to move from a linear vision of how we do research and innovation in life sciences to a more collaborative and more tightly linked ecosystem where basic applied research, translational, and development and manufacturing really feedback on each other's as should be, because they all need each other, and because that's the best way, as we saw in the pandemic, of really going from discovery to having at scale a drug or a therapeutic intervention that is able to save lives. So with this, I will end. Next slide. I want to thank my office for the incredible work they have done over the 18 months of the pandemic, the incredible colleagues in government and in academia who have helped us, and the government of Canada who has listened from time to time to our advice as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona, for a great summary. We have about 10-15 minutes now for sort of a broader conversation, perhaps. I'll start perhaps with Mona to ask there's a couple of questions in the chat about your presentation, and then people can feel free to jump in after that. So the first question, I'll take a crack at this one. We're the kings of fragmentation in Canada. You've mentioned, you mentioned sort of provincial jurisdiction, and John alluded to the sort of, sledgehammer approach, which basically, get people on board, want to get people on board and share data and, forget about the others. That's a little difficult for us to do here, but we're also fragmented in the funding landscape. Mona, as you well know, there's, the CFI that funds infrastructure, CHR funds, sort of operating grants. There are new programs that have been rolled out over the years to, try to do larger things. We're all pretty excited at the new strategy that you described today. I think the research community recognizes that there's a need for, sort of broader, sort of end-to-end, biomanufacturing pipeline in different areas. My question was, how do you actually, what kind of metrics are you actually going to use to see if that's more successful than the past model?
Well, look, I think it's a tough question, because there's no question that whenever you start tweaking the system, you have to be very careful, because you have to have a holistic approach. You can't just like tweak one part and just leave the other one as is. It's just like not gonna work. So we do the very important thing is to have evaluation of basically success and continuous evaluation and of any changes that we do to our system embedded in anything new that we do. Now, you can say that you'll only find out many years later whether it's better or not than the existing system that we have. But the reality is that we need to continue strengthening basic research and looking at it from the like the outcome and going back, like sort of reverse engineer things. It shouldn't be when you're a researcher, if you're interested in developing a diagnostic, to ask yourself whether you should be applying to CIHR or NSERC. It's just like how this happens should not be the researchers and the trainees' problem. So, we're going to have to simplify the system. There's no question about it. And we have to be prepared to evaluate whether, we're not going to get it perfect from the get-go. And just like continuously improve on things. But right now, and it's not new, Philippe, as you know, there was a fundamental, science review in 2018 that made some significant recommendations about simplifying the system. And I think that we have to be honest with ourselves, and we need to see how best to simplify, the system, and make sure that we deliver on missions, not on programs coming out of silos.
Thank you, Mona. There's a question in the chat from Marta Corrego, addressed to Mona, and then we'll move to a broader discussion with John. Question from Marta. Thank you, Mona, for your clear and honest presentation. Some people say the best pandemic preparedness is fundamental research. How will Canada make sure that this aspect of research is recognized and gaps do not present themselves?
Like I said, I think there has been clear recognition of the importance of basic research, how this is going to translate into action. We can only be optimistic and work together to reinforce this. We have a great momentum and attentive government and public as well. This is not going to be the last pandemic. We're not at the end of what we need to do in terms of enhancing human health. And we have big challenges ahead of us, like climate change, that also impact on health. So where we're going to need a lot of science. So I think the momentum is really excellent to making the case for basic research. This being said, I think that we can do both great basic research and also, bring together all the excellence in basic research to address specific, complex problems in front of us in a mission-oriented manner, exactly like, what the UK successfully did and what we, are going to need to do. So we need to do both. And that's why, our system is going to have to be excellent, flexible, and communicate, across all the different pillars in a most effective way.
Thank you, Mona. Question for, I guess, John, again from Mark Lateral. The EU Horizon programs have greatly benefited mid-sized countries with strong science. The UK is continuing its membership in principle. What would you see as the potential for Canada to move to a more integrated approach with the EU? John, I think you're on mute.
So yeah, thanks, Philippe. So I think what we all realize is that science absolutely requires interactions between scientists in multiple countries. I mean, it just doesn't work if you're not international in your approach to science. And so I think you have to create a structure which allows and encourages as wide an interaction, collaboration, sharing of resources, sharing of projects, and ideas. And that, of course, was the benefit of the Horizon program. It provides access to lots of good scientists in all the European countries. But I also think that the UK is now going to be pretty interested in looking offshore, not just at Europe, but at Canada, at Australia, at the US, and at emerging countries in Asia with strong research interests. And I think it would be good for Canada to get in a position where it could interact with the Horizon program, but they should also leave their options open for clear bilaterals with other countries, which actually in some ways are a bit easier to control. I mean, Mark and I have done a number of Horizon programs over the years together, and they've been quite successful, but they're quite heavy lifting because you've got a lot of people involved. It's difficult to manage as many as 10 or 12 different sites to get stuff to happen. So I'm a bit of a fan of bilateral interactions as well, because I think they're just as powerful.
Philippe, may I answer also this question?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, this was the next question was for both John and Mona. What way forward for new ambitious collaborations between Canada and the UK? So you can sort of, navigate that interface, Mona, no problem.
Just like, on the EU horizon, just like a reminder that last spring, the Prime Minister announced officially that the negotiations are starting between Canada and the EU for an associate membership for Canada in the Horizon program, and the negotiations are ongoing as we speak. This being said, I am a big fan of bilateral and multilateral collaborations, and I think that we have a lot of course, great collaboration, individual collaborations to build on with a handful of countries. Of course, the UK, the US, France, Germany being some of them. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities to do so. Over the summer, I held, in collaboration with the granting councils, bilateral roundtables in different areas. One was on pandemic preparedness, another was on AI and quantum, so advanced technologies and their applications to different areas. And the third was on climate change. So we had researchers from Canada and the UK on the one hand, and we had researchers from France and Canada who basically provided us with a sort of suggestions for a roadmap in terms of where are the opportunities and what can be done. And this is now being sort of elevated to a strategic level, and hopefully we'll be able to move forward on some of these suggestions. So very much a very important topic as we tackle together both pandemic preparedness but also climate change.
In closing, if we all, hindsight's always 20/20, but sometimes you need to look in the rearview mirror in order to plan the future. I'm just going to give this to both presenters. If something had to be done differently, let's just be blunt about it. Both in Canada and the UK, what would you do differently, John and Mona, if you'd been there, a little earlier? What would you have done differently?
Well, just to pick up on some of the thoughts that Mona had, one of the things in a crisis, a healthcare crisis like a pandemic, you can't afford to use the usual routes to make decisions. So, peer review didn't work for us either. It was a bloody disaster, actually. And you have to make executive decisions about what you're going to do. And you've got to have trusted people who can help you do that. Similarly, getting big task force with 50 people in them, that doesn't help you make decisions either. And we had that trouble as well. So the only task force that really worked for us was Kate Bingham's vaccine task force, and it had 8 people, all from industry on it. So I think you have to move into, if you're fighting a war, you have to move into a much more military-like decision making function. And, it won't go the way everybody wants it to, but it allows you to get stuff done quickly. And if you get people making decisions who know what they're doing, you won't get it all right, but you'll make progress. So that would be my advice to everybody.
Yeah. And I completely agree. I think, peacetime is the time to build the system, build the trust across the different actors. I think in Canada, it's really important that we have an approach to working together with the provinces and territories that is more streamlined and in the best interest of everyone. We had a lot of fragmentation even across science advice, and that that doesn't have to be this way. Science is science everywhere. After that, how you want to implement the advice is another story. And I agree that we just you just like have to have a different approach. You can't function by holding hands and making sure everybody's happy and agreeable to the final the decision. And there will be mistakes made, but the important thing is not, you know, to win every battle, but is to win the war.
Words of wisdoms. Thank you very much to both of you. We're just running out of time. We got 15 seconds left. I just want to, you know, thank again both of you for making time to come and present here. We all know how busy you are, and we greatly, greatly appreciate your participation in this symposium.